I'm walking on sunshine. Well, I'm walking on sunshine. Well, I'm walking on sunshine. Well, it's time to feel good. Hey, it's time to feel good. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Welcome to my session, to the session of love, laugh, learn, and lead with the 3 E's. My name is Doretha Winstead, and I bring you greetings as an educator from Kessel County. Thank you so much for jumping into this session, and I really, really hope you learn a lot, find some things to laugh about, and think about how you can lead as a beginning teacher. So let's dive right in. So I love a good quote. And as a beginning teacher, we all have this idea of what we're going to bring to the classroom and we're going to do with the art of teaching. But I always want to think and remind you that education is not the learning of facts rather than the training of the mind to think. And so no matter who you are, where you're from, it is about training the mind to think. And so that is what we all have in common as educators. So the objective of our session today will be to cover concepts, principles, and procedures of utilizing teacher efficacy, explaining how important and meaningful the triangulation of the teacher, student, and parent relationship and how it can support teacher success, and also equity in the classroom. And so it is my goal that once we complete our time together, you will be able to apply it to your classroom by utilizing the knowledge gained in order to enhance your pedagogy and align your practices with the North Carolina teaching standards. So as we move along, one of the main focuses for me, and I do feel like really for any educator, is being aware of what the teaching standards are. And so I myself was a BT, and over time I have grown to learn a lot about these standards. However, in such a program as a BT program, it really gives you a footing and opportunity to be a lot more intimate with your standards and being aware of what they ask of you. So I'm going to start by just kind of breaking these down a bit and just wanting you to think about each standard and what they mean. So standard number 1, teachers demonstrate leadership. I call this the classroom standard. This standard really deals with you leading in the classroom, demonstrating your leadership, and also advocating for your students, for your school, learning more about policy, being a change agent, and speaking up when you see opportunities and avenues to make a difference. And then also understanding the code of ethics. And so this standard just really challenges you to think about your position as a leader in your classroom. Standard number 2, I call the relationship standard. Standard number 2 is teachers establish a respectful environment for a diverse population of students. And in standard 2 really challenges you to think about how you engage with your students, creating an environment that fosters them to engage and build a relationship with you, treating students as an individual, and just embracing diversity. And we'll talk a little bit about that when we talk about our 3 E's in our session. Then adapting your teaching to benefit your students and even those with special needs. So factoring in the individualization of students, building those relationships, and setting high expectations for them. Okay. Standard number 3, which is teachers know the content they teach. And this is what I call the curriculum standard, obviously, because it challenges you to be more intimate with the curriculum in which you teach, irregardless of your area. So you align your instructions with the standard course of study, and then take that content and appropriate it in a way that connects and is relevant with your students. And so making instruction relevant and then recognizing the interconnectedness of your content area and disciplines is embodied in Standard 3. And Standard 4 is teachers facilitate learning for their students. Standard 4 is the meat and potatoes of it. I call this standard know your students academically, knowing and growing them, using that data, knowing what type of learners you have in your classroom, and appropriating that instruction that will pull them in, your visual learners, your auditory learners, your hands-on learners, and then utilizing technology, thinking about avenues that will pull all types of learners in and challenging them to be critical thinkers and problem solvers. And so when we start thinking about Standard 4 really gets us into working with our students, thinking about if we're communicating effectively when we're teaching and in our relationships, so that we build that bridge so students can be successful in your classroom, just creating all of those pathways so that students can learn during their time with you. And then there's lastly Standard 5. Teachers reflect on their practice. And this obviously is the reflection challenge. It challenges you to really think about, okay, now I've carried out that lesson. I've planned it, I've carried it out. Here are where my students are. Here's the data. What do I do with this? How do I make this? How do I take this data and formulate it back to either pull more students in or to kind of push students along? So thinking about that professional growth that's going to support you being a stronger teacher, being more successful in your classroom and in your school, and creating that environment that really supports student growth. So these standards are the basis of what we do every day. They're a way that as a teacher, you meet the expectations of the state and of your district as well as within your school. So I always employ you to get close and intimate with your standards so that you clearly know and have an understanding of what is expected from you as an educator. So let's move right along. So getting into our 3 E's that we're going to focus on during this session. And if you can see, I have empower in the cloud up top because I want that word empowerment to really hover over these 3 E's because we want to be empowered as educators. We also want our students to be empowered, as well as empowering parents, as well as the community. And so let's dive into this. So I want you to think about these 3 words and how you rank them as it relates to your classroom, with 1 being the most important. Would you rank engagement first? Would you rate equity first? Or would you rate efficacy first? So as you ponder and you think about, which one of these in my practice I feel like I'm strongest in, or I would rank number 1 as being the most important. As we go through our time together, I want you to really think about, what am I doing in these 3 areas that empower my students, empower my families and parents, and how does it empower within the community in which I serve? So I have what I call the triangulation theory. Okay. I believe that there is an important triangulation in the teaching profession because clearly we can't be teachers if we don't have students. And if families or parents don't send their students to our school, then our school obviously would become null and void. So we all need each other. And so this triangulation theory for me includes a school which embodies the expectation from the state and the district. It embodies the engagement with your students, as well as pulling in that participation, those opinions, and factors that come from families and the community. So we want to embody all of that and pull it all in together within our classroom to create relevance and validity for our school. So I go back to, why are the standards, when we start thinking about aligning those three components of that triangulation, then it's important to remember that the aspect of teaching is to be knowledgeable about the teaching standards and how they impact student learning and families across our state. Okay, when we think about the triangulation theory, we must consider how each standard contributes to the success of each component of the triangle. And so the basis of the standards are pretty much just for teacher preparation, teacher evaluation, and professional development as we strive to be 21st century teachers and learners. So back to the word empowerment. Here we go again. School, students, family, and community. Okay, as teachers, how do we empower each component of the triangle? And I'm going to dive right into that. So I'm going to start off with efficacy first. And the definition for efficacy is the belief of one's ability to succeed in achieving an outcome or reaching a goal. And so when we keep those things in mind, we want to really consider experiences. Okay, we want to think about the three components. What is each of their overall goals? Okay, so efficacy allows voice and choice. And so our overarching goal is to reach and teach with the intent to empower. So, as teachers, we must be intentional about enhancing self efficacy and creating opportunities for parents and community to be a part of the process. And so, in doing so, we want to go back to these experiences. And so, when we look at this diagram, which all points to self efficacy, if we think about the mastery experience, overall, it's important for us to keep in mind that it does not mean that individuals do not experience setbacks, okay, or failure along the way, but rather that they persist until they succeed. So when we think about our students, we want to create avenues for them to do it over again if they need to. So if they fail, they are learning forward, because genuine successful experiences raises a sense of competency and confidence. And so we want to create student leaders in our classroom. Okay. And so when we think about the vicarious experience, we want to keep in mind that knowledge and skills gained through observing, hearing, and reading is very powerful. And this happens through modeling. All right. And so whether it's their peers that are modeling, whether it's you that, you're modeling in the classroom, it is important for students to see the necessary skills, knowledge, and strategies that it takes to either achieve a task or accomplish a goal and completion. And so that's kind of that mentality that we talk about now, that I do, then we do it together, then you do it on your own. So that as an educator, you can truly see where students are. Okay. And so that goes back to our standards, having that clear idea of where students are academically, that standard forward, how we know, and then we grow them. Okay. And so then when we think about you know, the social part of it. We want to make sure as educators, when students are working in our class, that they are getting feedback from us, whether it's comments or it's reinforcement. So we want to think about how we can give positive messages, because we want students to build that confidence, and we want to provide positive reinforcement, and then encourage students to take on that amongst their peers. So creating that positive environment, where students are also encouraging one another, they're talking with one another, and they are advocating for one another. And so thinking about standard two, where we are building those relationships. And then also including the psychological and the emotional state of where your students are. And so this is important because we want them to feel excited about challenges, because that's a part of and helps strengthen that self efficacy. Thinking about how they can succeed, because when they don't and they become anxious or they become stressed, then it's a daunting task for us to try to pull them back in to feel confident and to accept the challenge of learning again. So sometimes as educators, we take on positions where students don't always get that, whether it's at home or they've been through something traumatic that really impacts them psychologically and emotionally. And so learning how to support them and encourage them to take away that anxiety and stress so that they can feel empowered in our classes and then feel okay with making decisions so they can succeed. So we're going to keep chugging right along. So I want you to keep in mind, when it comes to efficacy, we set the tone. Okay. So you say, how do we do that, Ms. Winstead? Well, I'm glad you asked. So we set the tone when we think about the tone in which we set. So when we think about how we set the tone, let's take a look at number one here. Okay. Teachers gain a clear understanding of their ability to impact the success of students through the strategies they implement within the classroom. And I love leader in me, because this really employs us to be leaders in our classroom, which reverts back to standard one, where, we are leading, we are demonstrating the leadership, not just in our classroom, but in our schools. So having a clear understanding of your ability to impact the success of students based on the strategies that you implement in the classroom and in your lessons. You think about setting student expectations and communicating with parents so that they are aware of what you expect of your students. And then not only that, taking your school's mission and vision and embodying that in your classroom really creates that success and helps students to really understand what you expect out of them. Number two, teachers work in multiple roles in their school to gain knowledge and increase job satisfaction. This is huge because you have the opportunity to really grow your school. And so I teach middle school, and I can remember during my beginning teacher years that my principal asked me to take roles in my school. And I was so nervous because I was new to the profession of teaching and had gained all of this responsibility of the students in my class and then my role as a teacher. And so I thought, I was like, man, I'm going to take something else on. But then once I learned, I began working outside of the classroom in my school, whether it was supervising a game or being a part of a committee. It gave me more knowledge about the heartbeat of my school. And so then I became more knowledgeable and was able to support my school from multiple angles when we start thinking about, okay, what's really going on in my school outside of my four walls. And the students really see that, and they take pride and also ownership in their position as a student in the school if they see you doing the same thing. So think about working in multiple roles in your school, even though sometimes, especially now where we're kind of working online and face to face, we're wearing a lot of hats right now. But there are still ways to really participate in your school outside of your classroom. And then number three, teachers work to be lifelong learners while aligning their pedagogy and best practices in order to create learning experiences for themselves and their students. And so this is also important that you continue to participate in professional developments just as you are now, that will continue to share knowledge, one common knowledge, because if you're specific about your professional development, then it helps to really align your standards with best practices in your room. And so we always say two heads are better than one, or we learn better together. So when you're able to share in a professional development with your colleagues that either teach the same grade or subject as you, then you get to kind of springboard with one another and share ideas and things of that nature. So number three is very powerful. We set the tone. And so whether it's in your classroom, in your school, or in your district, you have so many opportunities to be a leader. So let's continue chugging right along. So now we say, how do we do that, Ms. Winstead? How do we employ kids, students to have, have the confidence to make choices and to exercise efficacy in the classroom, having a positive mindset and feeling like they're succeeding? And I love just thinking about these, and I've just really gained this knowledge myself as I too started out as a beginning teacher, and really thinking about, how am I moving my students along on a daily basis and a yearly basis? So we go from a fixed mindset to a growth mindset, learning that making mistakes, even in our mistakes, we grow forward. And so changing that perception of that it's got to be on point, it's got to be precise, it's got to be right every single time, really puts a lot of anxiety and stress on students. So feeling okay to make a mistake and grow from it, and then providing students opportunity to redo, reset, and show that they are capable of learning and knowing and growing. The next one is we want to go from a mindset of what not to do to what you will do. And so we think about those things that are negotiable and things that are non-negotiable, and teaching students that verbiage, that there is flexibility, but there are things that there is not flexibility there, because that's how the real world works. And so we want to go from this is what I want to see. Okay. This is what will keep you moving along versus not, don't, punishment, punishment, punishment. We want to stay away from those negative words. Okay. We also want to think about ability praise versus effort praise. And so we don't want to always praise when students get it right. We want to praise the effort, because if they get it right, where do they go from there? So we are constantly growing students along the way. That is what is important. Okay. And then thinking about, instead of using classroom rules, we use classroom expectations. Okay. So if we don't meet those expectations, then what? Versus if we break a rule, then what? And so we want to stay away from that robotic my way or no way, there is no leeway. And so when we think about practicality, it's just not practical when we have various types of learners in a room that we kind of work to create robots. And that a lot of times causes students to be very stressed and sometimes can create a negative tone in the classroom and create anxiety because they just want to get it right. And when they don't feel there's flexibility there. So we want to keep them really kind of seesawing a little bit. We want them to experience some bumps along the way, make those mistakes so we can support, encourage, and give them positive affirmations to cheer them on because we set the stage for the next level of their education. And so we want to move and not move, I guess, in a mindset of dictate or instruct. We want to facilitate and model. So, really and truthfully, the guidelines that you use in your classroom, you should be modeling those same expectations. If you want respect, you should give respect. If you expect students to respect boundaries that you create, you have to also allow them to share their boundaries and respect those boundaries with students as well. So it is reciprocal. We give, we take, we give and we take, and it creates an environment where we are working to what? Empower. We want to empower students. So, you know, before I go on to engagement, because I definitely think, moving from efficacy, I want you to keep in mind that even, you think about your supervisor and administrator, you want them to approach you in a certain type of manner. And so, what you would expect or what you would have them to do, we want to have those same guidelines when we engage and work with students. So I'm going to move on into engagement. Okay. And when we think about engagement, I want you to think of the word culture. Okay. Sometimes we affiliate culture with diversity, but there is a tone that we set, which is our school culture, and it's based off high values that are held in our school, or sometimes not so high values that are held, behaviors that are experienced, beliefs that our families and students embody, and then attitudes that we take with approaching various situations. And so when I think about culture, I think of being culturally aware of what your school embodies. You have to think about the students that you serve and the diversity of those students. And so, culturally awareness to me means being embodied, being aware of how our students, our families, the community, and schools reflect the components of values, behaviors, beliefs, and attitudes towards certain things. And so then also further understanding how one's ethnicity has an impact on them and embracing our differences. And so when we think about engagement, it is highly important to be aware culturally of the students that reside in your school. Sometimes that can mean, respecting someone's religion or respecting cultural differences, or high standards and beliefs that are represented in the community. I also want to add that when we think about overall school culture, each teacher plays a part in a puzzle within the overall picture. So the culture you set in your classroom definitely spills out into the overall culture of your school. And so you want to always keep in mind that when you think about the values, behaviors, beliefs, and attitudes that you hold in your classroom, that it is reflective of that in which of the school holds, as well as either you are supporting that or you are working to be a change agent to implement that into your overall school culture. So being culturally aware of the diversity that is represented in your school, as well as the tones that you set in your classroom, all contributes to the overall culture of your school. So when we think about being culturally aware, we also have to think about and consider, are we culturally responsive? Do we reflect culturally responsive teaching in our classrooms? And so this is a huge factor when we think about student engagement. And so being culturally responsive, or having culturally responsive teaching strategies in your room, are very important. And that is a reflection. And the definition says culture is central to learning. So when we think about our lessons, how are the students in your classroom able to connect with the overall lesson? And so we as educators must be intentional about that, simply because we want to make our lessons relevant. So culture is central. It plays a role not only in communication and receiving information, but also in shaping the thinking process of groups and individuals. So when we are facilitating a lesson in our classroom, we want to be intentional about creating those avenues and pathways to extend the thinking. So we want to connect and then extend. A pedagogy that acknowledges, responds to, and celebrates fundamental cultures offers full, equitable access to education for students of all cultures. And so then when we reflect back to our standards, okay, we want to think about how we're connecting or creating that connectivity between our lessons and then the students, the facilitation, and the cultures in which they represent. So we automatically connect with the content in which we teach. But then we have to be intentional about the relevancy, making sure we're tapping into the learning styles in our classroom as we share the expectations in which we expect students to perform as we're going into a lesson, as well as the assessment techniques we implement to reflect what they've gained, and then looking at those outcomes, okay, based on our strategies and methods of teaching. Going back to that pedagogy, all right? So in doing so, we always want to think about how we are engaging students. And we at our school use what we call the 8 C's. However, we can incorporate the reading, the thinking, the writing, and the talking. And so even if we interchange those, where we are exposing through discussion, we are putting that literature in there to engage with that reading component, and then the outcomes, having students write out some form of their thought perception, or that level of engagement with the lesson, and then bringing it back and talking out what was our takeaway, including those strategies in every lesson, so that we're exposing, we're creating those experiences, we're challenging students to think about the standards and how they're connecting with it, and assessing their own learning. Going back to our standards, when we look at curriculum in standard 3, that's what we are looking at as a teacher. And then knowing and growing, giving them that information so that they can grow. And then looking at that data, their outcomes, whether they're writing or talking it out with us through our lesson. And so when we're engaging those students, we're engaging them on multiple levels to assess what it is they've gained. So I love this. Having lots of fun. And remember, we want laughter. We want learning. We want kids to know we love them, but we want to be the leader in that classroom in facilitating our standards and our lessons. So, another good quote: tell me and I forget. Teach me, I may remember, but when you involve me, I learn. So thinking about how can you make your lessons as hands-on as possible, because that's that concrete project-based learning. And there are so many resources out there about progress-based project-based learning. Implementing those projects in your lessons that really pull students in, and to extend that thinking, encouraging them to be explorers and critical thinkers are super important when we think about student taking in information, processing, connecting with it, and then seeing that in their outcomes to gauge what they've gained. The data. All right. Love this. So when we think about engagement, we've talked about students. What does that mean for families and communities? So I put together some things, one that have been extremely successful for me as a classroom teacher, and definitely been successful for my school in bringing these components in. And we think about that triangulation once again. So when we look at parents, how do we engage the parents? Communication, communication, communication. How do we regularly communicate with parents? We don't just want to communicate with them during progress reports and report cards. They should be able to see, hear, and know what's going on in our classrooms regularly. So whether we're celebrating students or we're voicing concerns or sharing goals, there should always be some form of communication. And I'm telling you, social media is a great outlet. One of the things I encourage students to do, and I send it home in my newsletter, is utilizing that social media outlet to see pictures, to see things that students are doing during their time, whether it's activities. I take photos of students, obviously with parents' permission, so that they can keep up with what's going on in the classroom. And also sending home those newsletters, even if they just say, "Hey, we're working on this standard. Here's the expectation. Here's what students are going to learn." And then emails, which we can send out a massive email to our parents just to keep them abreast of what's going on in our classroom. And then from a school level, if there are parent meetings or events coming up or games or things like that that's going on, the happenings in your school, sharing out those school updates as well. So we not only bridge the gap with the communication from us as a teacher, but we show them that we're also connected outside of our classrooms, so that then we help them bridge in and have another outlet. If they missed a call from the principal or they missed the letter that went home, they can always use even your social media feeds to pull back in to stay abreast of what's happening in the school as well as in your classroom. So, and then I always encourage you to take part in social events from your school, because students seeing you outside of that classroom is so powerful. And then not only that, a lot of times if students are spending time after school, that means at some point, whether their parents are picking them up or their parents are attending that event, it gives you the opportunity to have that social engagement beyond your room. And so then we switch over to the community, which I love this part, because community leaders and organizations, they really want to be involved in schools. And sometimes it's just the know-how. They don't necessarily know how until we reach out. So sometimes attending community events, if a student invites you to a rec game, or you hear about a festival, those are really, really great way to bridge the gap between community and your school. And so that's a part of being a leader in your school is you're not just coming in and being active in those four walls. You're getting out and getting to know the community in which you serve, especially if that's not the community that you live in. So attending community events can be very, very moving for your school and your school culture. And then incorporating the community history in your lesson. So, this is a great way to also include the diversity in your classroom. Sometimes you'll find, and I have found, that just talking about historical events that have happened over time within the community in which you serve also will connect students because they may have a grandparent, an aunt and an uncle, or even a parent who's very active and they're knowledgeable about events that occur and then can share those and enrich your lessons in your classroom. And a great way, which I love, is the last one, is inviting community guests, speakers for organizations or your politicians that represent your community is a great way to bridge the gap between that sometimes and unnaturally sometimes occurs between community and school. So when we think about engaging that triangulation, it empowers not only you as a leader in your school, it empowers your students, it makes things relevant to families, and then they also see how much you are invested and being intentional about bridging those gaps and bringing that community in as guest speakers through events and then incorporating that history. So you really have the opportunity to enrich the lives of the students in which you serve. So we're going to shift from engagement to equitable education. And so I love this one too, and have done a lot of studies, in my master's about equity in education. And so Merriam-Webster shares the definition that equitable or equity is having or exhibiting equity, dealing fairly and equally with all concerned. And so that's really making that your view and broadening that umbrella because of the students and the community in which we work very closely with. And so when we think about equity, a lot of times people think equality. And so we say, oh, what's the difference between equity and equality? I'm so glad you asked. When we think about that, we go back to our definition where we think about fairness. Okay. And so when we think about that, we want to keep in mind that equity and equality, we want to think about that background knowledge that students may come to our classroom with about being treated fairly, dealing with those biases, and sometimes even unknown biases that we carry. So we want to be very intentional about equity and equality. So while equality means treating every student the same, equity means making sure every student has the support they need to be successful. Okay, so equity in education requires putting systems in place to ensure that every child has an equal chance for success. And so this is where differentiation comes in. And it can be sometimes challenging to make sure that we are individualizing learning for our students, but it is something that is doable. It just requires us to be intentional and even sometimes reaching out to different departments to make sure we are providing those equal opportunity chances. So it may require you to utilize, your EC director or your EC teachers. It may require you to talk with your counselor, touching base with your coaches, because it takes a team to really provide overall differentiation in the classroom for students because we have to be knowledgeable in their backgrounds and experiences in order to provide equitable education in our classroom. So it requires just understanding the unique challenges and barriers faced by individual students, and also by populations of students, and providing additional support to help them overcome those barriers. So this is why that team becomes critical. Being knowledgeable of your IEPs and your 504s is very, very important, in understanding and how to meet the needs of our individual students. So while this in itself may not ensure equal outcomes, we all should strive to ensure that every child has equal opportunity for success. And so when we think about equity versus equality, it's that individualization that is very critical. So you say, well, how do we serve all students? And so when we think about um, understanding teacher efficacy, it really allows us to hone in on choice, in reaching and teaching students. So when we look at how we do it, here's what we do. We know every child and parent. So it's just as important that we know the parent as well as the child, because when we get to know the values and the behaviors and the perception that a parent has, we can help them better understand our efforts, as well as helping the parent help to navigate the child into student success. And so we also want to shift to our flex in your routine. So even though we have this perception where we want to do A, we want to do B so that we get to C and D, sometimes we have to have an A.1 and an A.2 and an A.3, building that in so that we are able to individualize our lessons, as well as our expectations in our classroom, to meet those individualized needs of students. Okay. And you'll be surprised at how that flexibility allows students to build confidence, and it will build trust, because they know that if they don't get it right, it's okay, that they're learning forward. All of this sets a tone in your classroom, and your kids that are introverts, you will start to see them sometimes kind of peel back those layers, because they know that if they make a mistake, it's okay. And so those flex in your routines don't really a lot of times cost us a thing, but it builds that foundation of trust in your classroom. And so you'll find that students will rise to the occasion because of that flexibility. Even in classroom expectations, they understand that even if I don't meet the mark, if I break a rule, that I'm going to be able to talk it out, I'm going to be able to learn forward, and it's okay to make mistakes. So we're going to shift to becoming a warm demander. Show compassion, then ask. Miss Winstead, Miss Winstead, Miss Winstead. I don't want kids screaming out my name whenever, they want to go and do something or they have a question, but showing them, modeling, okay, I'm not going to say, why are you calling my name? I'm going to say, okay, I hear you, but zip your lips, giving those reminders over and over and over again. Because let's face it, if we were held to A, B, C, and D all the time, and we weren't allowed room, even during this time of remote learning, if your lesson plans were due in a demanding manner, or if you were demanded that your kids perform at a certain level, even during this time where we're having to teach face to face and virtually, it would really make things very stressful. Even though we're held to an expectation, the demand is sometimes flexible. So even when we don't always meet the mark, we want just a little bit of flexibility, but we appreciate when we receive those warm demanders. And so reminders are great. And then showing that compassion, that I see your efforts and thank you for asking, can really build confidence and relationships for students. So over to our next one. We want to make it a safe place to fail. Because that's what learning is all about. We talk a lot about perseverance, but we want to show students that even when they don't meet the mark, that there's flexibility, but we expect for them to persevere through it, get back up, and keep moving forward. And this is how student success really comes about. Okay. And then we want to practice lean in assessments. Okay. We want to practice those. When we think about overall assessing students, we want to think about, okay, when we give them that assessment, where do they go from there if they don't meet that standard? Where do we go? How do we build that, rebuild that foundation that kind of has missing pieces? And so, thinking about assessments or being proactive about the layers of assessment is important. Quizzes are just as important as that final assessment so that kids can gauge along the way, okay? And they can see the progress in which they make so that whenever they do meet that standard, they can say, well, I missed it here and I missed a little bit of it there, but now I got it. So that self-gauging and self-empowering for students can be monumental in your strategies in the classroom. And then view culture as a resource. Ask students, have you ever experienced this? Or, what are your beliefs behind this? Do you celebrate this? Or, just asking them and pulling them in as resources can really build confidence. And we go back to providing equitable opportunities for students to discuss, students to share out, and boy, oh boy, students to engage. So, as we reach the end, in summary, I want you to know being a BT, I tell, the BTs here that I work with that veteran teachers have no idea what beginning teachers really embrace coming into the profession of teaching, because you come in and you teach. You have to balance out your life outside of school if you are a mom or dad or a caregiver, irregardless whether even if you don't have anyone that you see after, maybe efforts you engage with in your community, creating that work-life balance along with going to school to complete your licensure, and then being a part of a BT program, which is also an extended responsibility within your district. You are in an amazing profession, and BTs really, really are shifting, and programs are shifting how educators are coming in and embracing the world and the profession of education. So you are in a position to literally change the lives of children, to change the lives of families, as well as make a positive impact on your school and the community in which you serve. Being intentional about your pedagogy and best practices can provide experiences of a lifetime. I want to take the time to tell you, even though it's a big responsibility, enjoy the journey. Keep in mind that you are always learning along with your students, and that is a powerful pivot and tool to use. When you talk to your students, you can share your experiences with them. There is nothing like being vulnerable in front of your students because it teaches them that you are human. You are just dealing with it from a different perspective, and you will make mistakes, and that's okay. Even sometimes, even in a reprimand. Lord, I hope that you're not reprimanded, but if your administrator comes to you and says, you really were supposed to do it this way, even though you didn't do it or you did it that way, it's a learn forward all the time. And so reflect, reflect, reflect. Use that reflection to make the necessary changes along the way. Take time to enjoy your students, and remember, you are their only. Whether you are an elementary teacher, a middle school teacher, or a high school teacher. You are their only first grade experience, their only middle school math, ELA, social studies, science, elective teacher. You are their only. And as you move along this journey, always, always, always remember you are granted the gift of another day. And so remember to love your students, love yourself, love what you do, and look for avenues to laugh along the way. Laugh with those kiddos. They love to see that you are human. And while they are learning, and you are learning, remember that you are a leader, okay? Even when you don't feel like it. So as we move and come to the end of this session, okay, please, please don't hesitate. Here is my contact information. You are welcome to email me. You are welcome to text or call. I would encourage text only because when I don't know strange numbers, I'll prompt you to leave a message, but please do leave me a voicemail. I would love to connect with you and, support you if I can in any way. I have the hours here from 4 to 6, typically because I normally try to leave school around the 4 o'clock hour. But please do feel free to reach out to me anytime. I'm just realizing that I didn't put my Twitter on here, but if you look my name up in Twitter, you'll be able to see some of my classroom feeds and things that I do in my classroom. But this has been such a pleasure to be able to provide this session to you. I believe that BTs are powerful. I too was a BT and someone helped me along the way. So I just want to pay it forward to share this session with you. And please know, even on your worstest day where you don't feel like it, you are amazing. You are amazing. So I encourage you to be the sunshine in your school and continue to enjoy this great profession of education. Thank you for attending my session, and I bid you well. Have a great summer, and I look forward to the contacts that lie ahead. Thank you so much for attending.